This is the story of a girl who lost everything in one night, but discovered a strength she never knew existed. Grace Mitchell was the kind of girl everyone in the Surula community of Lagos admired. At 17, she was bright, respectful, and always willing to help her neighbours. Her father, Mr. Daniel Mitchell, was a respected civil servant who held his head high in the community, and her mother, Mrs. Helen Mitchell, was known for her kindness and warmth. They weren't wealthy, but they had dignity, and in their world, dignity meant everything. Grace had dreams. She wanted to finish secondary school, maybe go to university and become a teacher. She loved children and often helped tutor younger students in the neighborhood for free. Her smile could light up a room and her laughter was infectious. People would say, "That Grace, she's going places. Mark my words." But life has a way of changing everything in a single moment. It started on a rainy Saturday evening in October. Grace had been feeling unwell for weeks, nauseous in the mornings, tired all the time, dizzy spells that came without warning. Her mother noticed but assumed it was malaria or maybe stress from her upcoming WAC exams. They went to a small clinic near their home, just to be sure. Grace sat on the worn examination table, her legs swinging nervously as the nurse, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, asked her questions. Her mother stood beside her, holding her hand. The nurse asked Grace to step into another room for a test, and Helen waited outside, humming softly to herself, completely unaware that the next 10 minutes would change their lives forever. When Grace walked back out, her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. The nurse followed behind her with a folder in her hand and a look of pity on her face. Helen's heart began to race. "Mrs. Mitchell," the nurse said quietly, "your daughter is pregnant, about 3 months along." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Helen's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Grace stood frozen, tears streaming down her cheeks, her body trembling. "Pregnant," Helen whispered, her voice breaking. "Grace, how, who?" Grace couldn't speak. She couldn't find the words to explain what had happened, how Mr. Victor, her father's trusted friend and business associate, had taken advantage of her one afternoon when she was sent to deliver documents to his house. How he had threatened her, told her no one would believe her if she spoke. How she had buried the shame deep inside, hoping it would go away. But now it was too real, too undeniable. The ride home was silent except for Helen's quiet sobs. Grace stared out the window, watching the rain pour down, feeling like her entire world was collapsing. When they arrived home, Daniel was in the living room reading the newspaper. He looked up with a smile that quickly faded when he saw their faces. "What happened?" he asked, standing up immediately. Helen couldn't even speak. She just looked at Grace, tears streaming down her face, and Grace knew she had to say something. "Papa," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible, I'm pregnant." The newspaper fell from Daniel's hands. For a moment, everything was still. Then his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You're what?" he shouted, his voice shaking the walls. "You're pregnant, you." "Daniel, please." Helen tried to intervene, but he raised his hand to silence her. "Who is responsible for this?" he demanded, moving closer to Grace. "Who did this to you?" Grace opened her mouth to tell him the truth, to tell him about Mr. Victor, but fear gripped her throat. What if he didn't believe her? What if he blamed her anyway? I can't say," she whispered. "You can't say?" Daniel's voice was thunderous now. "You bring this shame upon my house, upon my name, and you can't even tell me who is responsible." "Daniel, she's scared," Helen pleaded. Scared, Daniel turned to his wife. "Do you know what this means, Helen? Do you know what people will say, that I raised a prostitute, that I couldn't control my own daughter?" "Papa, please, I'm sorry." Grace fell to her knees, sobbing. "Sorry," Daniel laughed bitterly. "Sorry doesn't erase the shame you've brought upon this family. Sorry doesn't restore my reputation." Hey my people, if you're feeling this story, drop a like right now and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. This journey is about to get intense, and I need you all with me. Subscribe if you haven't already. You don't want to miss what happens next. Trust me. Now let's get back to Grace, because her nightmare was only just beginning. The next few days were unbearable. Daniel refused to speak to Grace. He wouldn't even look at her. Helen tried desperately to mediate, to make him understand that Grace was still their daughter, that she needed them now more than ever. But Daniel's pride was wounded too deeply. In his mind, Grace had destroyed everything he had worked for, everything he had built. His reputation in the community meant everything to him, and now it was shattered. Neighbors began to whisper. Somehow, word had gotten out. Grace could feel their stares when she walked to the market with her mother. She heard the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she came near. "Isn't that the Mitchell girl?" "Yes, the one who got pregnant. What a shame." Her poor father, after everything he did for her. One evening, Pastor James from their church came to visit. He was a kind man, soft-spoken and gentle. He sat with Daniel in the living room while Helen and Grace listened from the kitchen. "Brother Daniel," Pastor James said carefully, "I understand your pain, but Grace is still your daughter. She needs you now more than ever. God teaches us about forgiveness and mercy." "Forgiveness," Daniel's voice was cold. "She has disgraced me, Pastor. She has made me a mockery in this community. Your daughter is hurting, Daniel. Whatever happened, she's just a child who needs her father." "She's no longer my daughter," Daniel said flatly. "A daughter of mine would never bring this kind of shame upon my household." Pastor James tried to reason with him, but Daniel's heart was hardened by pride and anger. After the pastor left, Helen begged her husband to reconsider. "Daniel, please," she cried, holding his arm. "She's our only child, we can't abandon her." "I have made my decision," Daniel said coldly. "She has 1 week to leave this house. I will not harbor shame under my roof." Grace heard everything from her room. She curled up on her bed, hugging her pillow, feeling the baby move inside her for the first time. That tiny flutter of life that should have brought joy instead brought only fear and despair. Over the next few days, several neighbors and church members came to plead on Grace's behalf. Mrs. Okonkwo from next door, Uncle Emeka who had known Grace since she was a baby. Even some of Grace's former teachers came to speak with Daniel. But each time his answer was the same. "She has brought shame upon my house. I cannot forgive this." On the 7th day, Daniel packed Grace's belongings into a small bag and placed it outside the front door. Helen sobbed uncontrollably, holding Grace tight, refusing to let go. "Mama, it's okay," Grace whispered, though tears were streaming down her own face. "I'll be fine, I promise I'll be fine." "Where will you go?" Helen cried. "You have nowhere to go." "God will make a way," Grace said, trying to sound braver than she felt. Daniel stood at the doorway, his face hard as stone, watching as his daughter picked up her bag. Grace looked at him one last time, hoping to see even a flicker of love or regret in his eyes. But there was nothing, just cold, unforgiving judgment. Grace turned and walked away from the only home she had ever known, carrying a small bag and a life growing inside her. She was 17, pregnant and completely alone in Lagos, a city that showed no mercy to those who fell. As she walked down the street, rain began to fall again, soaking through her clothes. She had nowhere to go, no plan, and only a few hundred naira in her pocket. But what Grace didn't know was that the man responsible for her suffering, the man who had destroyed her innocence, was closer than she thought, watching her from the shadows with a smile on his face. Would she survive what was coming next? Or would Lagos swallow her whole before she ever had a chance to tell her truth? The darkness was just beginning. Grace walked through the rain-soaked streets of Lagos with no destination in mind. Her bag grew heavier with each step, and her feet ached, but she kept moving because stopping meant facing the reality of her situation. She was homeless, pregnant, and completely alone. For the first 2 nights, she slept at a bus stop in Yaba, using her bag as a pillow and her wrapper as a blanket. She barely slept because of the noise, the cold, and the fear. Men would pass by and stare at her, some making comments that made her skin crawl. She learned quickly to keep her head down and avoid eye contact. By the 3rd day, her money was almost gone. She had spent it on pure water and bread, rationing each meal to make it last. Her stomach cramped constantly, and she didn't know if it was from hunger or the pregnancy. She felt weak and dizzy, but she had to keep going. Grace tried to find work, anything that would give her money for food and shelter. She went to shops, restaurants, and markets begging for any kind of job, but when people saw she was pregnant and young, they turned her away. Some looked at her with pity, others looked at her with disgust. "We don't need your kind here," one shop owner told her bluntly. "Go back to wherever you came from." Grace swallowed her tears and kept searching. She had no choice. On the 5th day, as Grace sat under a bridge near Ojulegba, counting the last of her coins, an older woman approached her. The woman was well dressed, with a kind face and warm eyes. She carried a basket of fruits and walked with a gentle grace that reminded Grace of her mother. "My dear," the woman said softly, sitting beside Grace. "Are you all right? You look like you haven't eaten in days." Grace looked up, surprised by the kindness in the woman's voice. Tears filled her eyes, and before she could stop herself, she was crying. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered, wiping her face. I'm just tired." The woman placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. "What's your name, child?" "Grace." "Grace," the woman repeated with a smile. "What a beautiful name. I'm Mrs. Folake. Tell me, where are your parents? Why are you out here alone?" Grace hesitated, but something about Mrs. Follick's gentle manner made her feel safe. She told her everything, about her father's rejection, about being forced to leave home, about having nowhere to go. Mrs. Follick listened carefully, nodding and making sympathetic sounds. When Grace finished, the older woman sighed deeply. "Oh, my dear child," Mrs. Follick said, shaking her head. "No young girl should have to go through this alone. Listen, I have a spare room in my house in Eichja. You can stay with me until you have the baby. I'll help you." Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Really, you would do that for me?" "Of course," Mrs. Follick smiled. "I was young once too. I know what it's like to need help. Come, let's get you home and fed properly." Grace felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone cared. Finally, she had a place to stay. She followed Mrs. Follick to a bus stop, and they travelled to a modest house in a quiet neighbourhood in Eichja. The house was simple but clean. Mrs. Follick showed Grace to a small room with a bed, a wardrobe, and a window that overlooked the street. It felt like paradise after sleeping at bus stops. "Rest now," Mrs. Follick said. "I'll prepare something for you to eat." Grace lay down on the bed and cried tears of gratitude. Maybe God had sent Mrs. Follick to save her. Maybe things would be okay after all. For the next few weeks, life seemed to improve. Mrs. Follick fed Grace well, made sure she rested, and even bought her maternity clothes. Grace helped with chores around the house and began to feel like she was part of a family again. Her baby bump grew, and for the first time she felt a flicker of hope about the future. But then things began to change. Mrs. Follick started receiving visits from a man, a wealthy-looking man who drove an expensive car and wore designer clothes. His name was Chief Adebio, and whenever he came, Mrs. Follick would send Grace to her room and tell her to stay there until he left. Grace found it strange, but she didn't question it. She was grateful for the shelter and didn't want to cause any problems. One evening, about a month before her due date, Grace overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. She had woken up thirsty and gone to the kitchen to get water. As she approached, she heard Mrs. Follick's voice coming from the living room, talking on the phone. "Yes, Chief, the baby will be here soon," Mrs. Follick said quietly. "Don't worry, everything is arranged. Once she delivers, we'll handle it the way we discussed. She has no family, no one to ask questions. The girl is perfect for this." Grace froze, her heart pounding. Handle what? What did Mrs. Follick mean? "The payment better be ready," Mrs. Follick continued. 2 million naira as we agreed. You get a healthy newborn and I get my money. Everyone wins. Grace's hands began to shake. Mrs. Follick was planning to sell her baby. Fam, if you're as shocked as Grace right now, drop a like and hit that subscribe button because this story is about to take a dark turn. Comment below what you think Grace should do. Run or confront Mrs. Follick. Let me know your thoughts. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to hear this powerful story. Now, let's get back to Grace, because her next decision would determine whether her baby lived or died. Grace quietly returned to her room, her mind racing. She couldn't believe it. The woman who had seemed so kind, so caring, had only been using her. Mrs. Follick had never cared about Grace. She had only seen an opportunity to make money. Grace spent the entire night awake, planning her escape. She couldn't stay here. She had to leave before the baby came, before Mrs. Follick could take her child away. But where would she go? She had no money, no friends, no family. And she was heavily pregnant. She could barely walk for long periods without feeling exhausted. Still, she had no choice. She would rather die on the streets than let someone steal her baby. 3 days later, while Mrs. Follick was at the market, Grace packed her few belongings and quietly slipped out of the house. Her heart raced with every step, terrified that Mrs. Follick would return and catch her. She walked as fast as her swollen feet could carry her, moving through neighborhoods she didn't recognize, with no plan and no destination. All she knew was that she had to get as far away as possible. By evening, Grace's body was exhausted. Her back ached, her feet were swollen, and she felt sharp pains in her abdomen. She found a small park and sat on a bench, trying to catch her breath. That's when she saw it, a church across the street. It was a modest building with a white cross on top and a sign that read, "Living Hope Community Church, all are welcome." Grace stared at the church for a long moment. She hadn't prayed properly in weeks. After everything that had happened, she wasn't sure God was even listening anymore, but she had nowhere else to go. She stood up slowly and walked across the street. The church doors were open, and soft light spilled out into the darkening evening. Grace stepped inside and immediately felt a sense of peace wash over her. The church was empty except for one woman who was arranging flowers near the altar. She was in her early 40s with a warm face and gentle eyes. When she saw Grace, she smiled. "Hello, dear," the woman said kindly. "Can I help you?" Grace's lip trembled. I don't know where else to go. The woman walked over to her, concern filling her eyes. Are you all right? You look exhausted, and you're pregnant. When is your baby due? Soon, Grace whispered, maybe a few weeks. The woman gently took Grace's hand. My name is Linda, I'm a deaconess here. Come, sit down, let me get you some water. Linda brought Grace water and sat with her, listening as Grace poured out her story once again. The rejection, the betrayal, the escape from Mrs. Folklare's house. Linda's eyes filled with tears as she listened. When Grace finished, Linda squeezed her hand. You're safe now, Linda said firmly. We'll take care of you here, you and your baby will be safe. For the first time in months, Grace believed those words. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, sitting in that small church with Linda beside her, she felt hope stirring in her heart again. 3 weeks later, Grace went into labor. Linda stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand through every contraction, whispering words of encouragement. When Grace finally heard her baby's first cry, she wept. It was a girl, a beautiful, healthy baby girl. What will you name her? Linda asked, smiling through her own tears. Grace looked down at her daughter's tiny face and felt a love so powerful it took her breath away. Hope, Grace whispered. Her name is Hope. But just as Grace was beginning to rebuild her life, a shadow from her past was about to return. And this time, the danger would be even greater. Who was coming for Grace? And would the church's protection be enough to save her from what was lurking in the darkness? The storm was far from over. Grace spent the next 6 months at Living Hope Community Church, and for the first time since leaving home, she felt truly safe. Linda had become more than just a helper. She had become the mother figure Grace desperately needed. The church community embraced Grace and baby Hope with open arms. They donated clothes, diapers, and everything the baby needed. Pastor Michael and his wife provided Grace with a small room attached to the church, and Linda visited her every single day. But Linda didn't just offer Grace sympathy, she offered her something far more valuable: opportunity. Grace, Linda said one morning while they were having tea, you can't depend on charity forever. You need to learn a skill, something that can help you stand on your own feet. Grace nodded, bouncing Hope gently in her arms. I want to work, Sister Linda. I want to provide for my daughter, but I don't know what I can do. Linda smiled warmly. I own a small bakery not far from here. I've been watching you these past months and I see something special in you. You're strong, resilient, and you have a good heart. How would you like to learn how to bake? Grace's eyes lit up. Really, you would teach me? Not just teach you, Linda said. I'll train you properly. And if you're as dedicated as I think you are, you'll have a real future in this business. From that day forward, Grace's life took on new purpose. Every morning, she would wake up early, feed and settle Hope with one of the church mothers who volunteered to help, and then head to Linda's bakery. At first, the work was challenging. Grace had never baked anything more complicated than simple bread. But Linda was patient, showing her how to measure ingredients precisely, how to knead dough until it had the perfect texture, how to control oven temperatures for different pastries. Grace absorbed everything like a sponge. She stayed late, practiced during her free time, and asked questions constantly. She experimented with flavors and designs, always trying to improve. You have a natural gift, Linda told her one day, tasting a batch of Grace's vanilla cupcakes. These are incredible. Within a year, Grace had become Linda's best baker. Customers began specifically requesting pastries made by that young lady with the magic hands. Grace's signature chocolate chip cookies and butter cakes became so popular that Linda had to increase production. But Grace had bigger dreams. She saved every kobo she earned, living frugally and planning for the future. She watched how Linda ran the business, learned about costs, suppliers, marketing, and customer service. She studied everything. When Hope turned 2 years old, Grace approached Linda with a proposal. Sister Linda, Grace said nervously, I want to start my own small bakery. Nothing big, just something I can run from home at first. I've saved some money and I think I'm ready. Linda looked at Grace with pride shining in her eyes. I've been waiting for you to say that, and I'm going to help you make it happen. With Linda's guidance and a small loan from the church, Grace launched Hope's Kitchen, a home-based pastry business. She started small, taking orders from church members and neighbors, delivering fresh-baked goods every morning. Her cakes were beautiful, her pastries were delicious, and word spread quickly. Within 6 months, Grace had more orders than she could handle alone. She hired 2 other single mothers from the church to help her, and together they worked tirelessly to build something special. By the time Hope turned 3, Grace had saved enough money to rent a small shop in a busy area of Surrula. ironically, not far from where she had grown up. She transformed the space into a charming little bakery with yellow walls, fresh flowers, and the smell of fresh bread welcoming customers every morning. Hope's Kitchen became known throughout Lagos for its quality and Grace's inspiring story. People came not just for the pastries, but because they admired what Grace had accomplished. She had gone from homeless and rejected to becoming a successful business owner and a symbol of resilience. Grace's confidence grew with her business. She was no longer the scared, broken girl who had been thrown out of her father's house. She was strong, independent, and determined to create a better life for her daughter. But just when everything seemed perfect, danger came knocking at her door once again. One afternoon, a well-dressed woman walked into Hope's Kitchen. She was elegant, wearing designer clothes and expensive jewelry. Her name was Mrs. Victoria Reynolds, and she spoke with the polished accent of someone who had spent years abroad. "You must be Grace," Mrs. Reynolds said with a warm smile. "I've heard so much about you and your incredible story." Grace smiled politely, wiping flour from her hands. "Thank you, Ma. How can I help you today?" "Actually, I'm here to help you," Mrs. Reynolds said, looking around the shop approvingly. "I run a foundation that supports young female entrepreneurs, especially those who have overcome difficult circumstances. Your story is exactly the kind of success we want to amplify." Grace's heart skipped with excitement. "A foundation?" "Yes," Mrs. Reynolds nodded. "We provide funding, mentorship, and connections to help businesses like yours expand. I'd like to offer you an opportunity to scale Hope's Kitchen into something much bigger. We're talking multiple locations, major contracts, real growth." It sounded like a dream come true. Grace invited Mrs. Reynolds to sit down and they talked for over an hour. Mrs. Reynolds painted a picture of everything Grace could become: a brand, an empire, a national success story. "There's a training program in Abuja," Mrs. Reynolds explained. "It's a 3-week intensive course where we teach young entrepreneurs advanced business skills, connect them with investors, and set them up for major expansion. All expenses paid. You'd stay in a beautiful facility with other young women just like you." Grace hesitated. 3 weeks is a long time. I have my daughter and the shop." "Bring Hope with you," Mrs. Reynolds said smoothly. "We have childcare facilities, and your staff can manage the shop for 3 weeks, can't they? Hey my people, drop a like right now if you can feel something isn't right here. Comment below if you think Grace should trust Mrs. Reynolds or not. And fam, subscribe to this channel because you need to see what's coming next. This story is about to get darker than you can imagine. Now let's get back to Grace, because the decision she was about to make would either save her life or destroy everything she had built. Grace talked to Linda about the opportunity. Linda was supportive but cautious. "It sounds wonderful," Linda said carefully, "but please do your research first. Make sure this foundation is legitimate. Ask for references, check their website, talk to other women who have gone through the program." Grace agreed. She spent the next week researching the Reynolds Foundation online. The website looked professional, with glossy photos of smiling young women, testimonials, and impressive statistics about success rates. Everything seemed legitimate. Mrs. Reynolds provided references, phone numbers of women who supposedly went through the program. Grace called 3 of them, and each one praised the foundation enthusiastically, describing how it had transformed their businesses and lives. What Grace didn't know was that all of those women were paid actors, part of an elaborate trap. Convinced that the opportunity was real, Grace made arrangements to travel to Abuja. She left her 2 employees in charge of the shop, packed bags for herself and Hope, and boarded a bus with excitement and hope in her heart. When they arrived in Abuja, Mrs. Reynolds personally picked them up from the bus station in a luxury car. She drove them to a beautiful compound in Maitama, a wealthy neighborhood with mansions and manicured lawns. "Welcome to the Reynolds Center for Female Empowerment," Mrs. Reynolds said with a smile. The facility was stunning. It looked like a high-end hotel with conference rooms, a dining area, and comfortable bedrooms. There were about 15 other young women there, all around Grace's age, all with stories of struggle and dreams of success. For the first few days, everything seemed perfect. They attended seminars on business management, marketing, and financial planning. The instructors were professional, the food was excellent, and the accommodations were comfortable. Hope played happily with the other children in the childcare room. But on the 4th night, everything changed. Grace woke up to someone shaking her shoulder roughly. She opened her eyes and saw 2 large men standing in her room. Her heart seized with terror. "Get up," one of them said coldly, "and don't make a sound." "Where's my daughter?" Grace demanded, her voice shaking. "Where's Hope?" "The children are safe," the man said, "but whether they stay that way depends on how cooperative you are." Grace's blood ran cold as the horrifying truth crashed over her. This wasn't a training program. This was a trap. Mrs. Reynolds didn't run a foundation for entrepreneurs. She ran a sophisticated sex trafficking ring that preyed on vulnerable young women under the guise of helping them. The other women in the compound were being held against their will, forced into situations they couldn't escape because their children were being used as leverage. Some were sent to work in high-end brothels serving wealthy politicians and businessmen. Others were trafficked internationally. Grace was led downstairs to a room where Mrs. Reynolds sat behind a desk, her warm smile now replaced with cold calculation. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, Grace," Mrs. Reynolds said calmly. "But you're worth a lot of money. Beautiful, educated, resilient. Men will pay premium prices for someone like you. You have two choices: cooperate and see your daughter regularly, or resist and never see her again." Grace felt her whole body shaking, but somewhere deep inside, a fire ignited. She had survived her father's rejection. She had escaped Mrs. Folklare's plot to sell her baby. She had built a business from nothing. She was not going to be broken again. "I'll cooperate," Grace said quietly, lowering her eyes submissively. Mrs. Reynolds smiled, satisfied. Smart girl. But what Mrs. Reynolds didn't know was that Grace was already planning her escape. And this time, she wasn't just going to run. She was going to make sure Mrs. Reynolds and everyone involved in this evil operation paid for what they had done. How would Grace escape with hope? And could she really take down an entire trafficking network on her own? The war had just begun. Grace spent the next 3 days pretending to be the obedient captive Mrs. Reynolds wanted her to be. She smiled when required, nodded at instructions, and showed no signs of resistance. But behind her submissive facade, her mind was working constantly, observing everything, looking for weaknesses in the operation. She noticed the guards' shift patterns, how they changed every 6 hours, and there was always a 15-minute gap during the transition when security was lightest. She memorized the compound layout, counting exits and identifying which rooms had windows that could be opened. She befriended some of the other captive women, learning their stories and gaining their trust. One woman named Brenda had been there for 8 months. She had been lured with promises of a job as a nanny abroad and now couldn't escape because her son was being held in a separate location as collateral. "They're too powerful," Brenda whispered to Grace one night when the guards weren't watching. "Mrs. Reynolds has connections everywhere, politicians, police officers, even judges. Women who have tried to escape before were either caught and punished severely, or they disappeared completely." "What about evidence?" Grace asked quietly. "Records, documents, anything that proves what they're doing." Brenda shook her head. "Mrs. Reynolds keeps everything digital, locked away on her laptop. No one has access except her and maybe her second-in-command, a man named Tyrese." Grace's mind raced. She needed that laptop. She needed evidence that could expose this entire operation so thoroughly that no amount of money or connections could make it disappear. On the 5th day, Grace was told she would be prepared for her first client, a wealthy businessman from Abuja who had specifically requested her. The thought made her stomach turn, but she kept her face neutral. "I want to see my daughter first," Grace said calmly to the guard who delivered the message. "Just for 5 minutes, please, I need to know she's okay." The guard looked uncertain, but Grace had been so cooperative that he agreed. He escorted her to the childcare area, where Hope and the other children were being kept under watch by 2 women. When Hope saw her mother, she ran into Grace's arms crying, "Mama, Mama, I want to go home." Grace held her daughter tight, fighting back her own tears. "Soon, baby. Very soon we're going home, but Mama needs you to be brave for just a little longer, okay?" She kissed Hope's forehead and whispered something in her ear, instructions only her daughter would understand. Hope nodded, wiping her tears. That night, as Grace was being taken to a preparation room where she would be dressed and made up for the client, Hope created a distraction in the childcare area. She began screaming and throwing things, acting completely out of control. The 2 women supervising the children rushed to calm her down, and in the chaos, no one noticed that Grace had slipped away from her escort during the shift change. Grace moved quickly through the corridors, her heart pounding. She had memorized the route to Mrs. Reynolds' office from her careful observations over the past days. The door was locked, but Grace had watched one of the guards enter the code into the keypad several times. She had excellent memory for details. Her hands shook as she entered the numbers, 281976. The lock clicked open. Inside, the office was dark except for the glow of a laptop on the desk. Grace's pulse raced as she sat down and opened the computer. It was password protected, but Grace noticed a sticky note partially hidden under a notepad with what looked like password hints. She tried several combinations before one finally worked. The screen unlocked, and Grace's eyes widened at what she saw. Spreadsheets with names, ages, locations. Photographs of young women, dozens of them, with prices listed beside their images like they were merchandise. Bank account details showing transfers of millions of naira. Email correspondence with buyers discussing transactions in cold, clinical language. Video files showing women being transporting, held captive, and worse. This wasn't just evidence. This was a complete map of an entire trafficking network operating across Nigeria and beyond. Grace's hands moved frantically. She inserted a flash drive she had stolen from one of the administrative offices earlier and began copying everything, every file, every photo, every document. The progress bar moved painfully slowly. 50%, 60%. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside, her breath caught in her throat. 75%, 80%. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Grace heard voices, two guards talking. "Did you check Mrs. Reynolds' office?" "Not yet, let's do another sweep of the compound first." 90%, 95%. The footsteps moved away. Grace exhaled shakily. 100%, transfer complete. She ejected the flash drive, closed the laptop, and slipped out of the office just as quietly as she had entered. Her heart was still racing, but she had done it. She had the evidence. Now she needed to escape. Fam, if you're on the edge of your seat right now, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what you think happens next. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this story is reaching its peak, and you don't want to miss the explosive finale. Share this with someone who needs to hear about real courage.